Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Microlink DWP webinar, Supporting Disability Confidence. We're Disability Confident Leaders. We hope we can encourage all of you to move to that status. Before I introduce the two fabulous people we have today, just some housekeeping to say there's closed captions at the bottom of your screen. If you push the button, they will come up for you. We are recording this session. We do have some marketing collateral to come out to you at the end, including the fabulous playbook that Susan Scott Parker has written that we think you will find extremely useful. So without further ado, can I introduce you to ladies first, to Ms. Scott Parker. Can you tell us a bit about yourself? Hello.
Well, I founded the first business disability network, the one in the UK, but now I'm the strategic advisor to the ILO's Global Business and Disability Network, to the amazing Purple Space. Many of you, I trust, are members of that extraordinary network of networks. And I work with G3ICT, the global initiative enabling access to digital everything as a right, and various other bits and pieces.
You do bits around the UN and all sorts, though, don't you?
Occasionally, this is true. This
is true. Wonderful. Thank you. And Giles.
Good afternoon. Giles Barker, Workplace Disability Lead for Channel 4. Similar to Susan, I also work with Purple Space. I'm a Purple Space ambassador and chair their Networkology Impact Forum. I'm also a disability and access advisor for the Cabinet Office around the area of creative industries.
Wow, wonderful. Well, actually, what we're going to do in this session is cover off a different couple of areas. We're going to start with Giles, who's going to talk to his work experience and building the knowledge base that he's got and how it's impacted at Channel 4 and landed and what he does to keep it fresh. So Giles, can you talk a bit about that?
Certainly. Thanks very much for the introduction. So I've been here about 3 years. It was actually a new role for Channel 4. And they wanted to make sure that we have that, as you say, that kind of not just adherence to kind of the legislation, but kind of maturing that process over time. And I think you do need to have someone who's a focal point for keeping that flywheel of change kind of moving. So my core role in Channel 4 is to look after workplace adjustments, to support disabled staff and also their managers to make that, I suppose you could say, is it a satisfying workplace adjustment service? Is it satisfying for the individual? Is it delivering the benefits for the individual, for the manager, for the team? But also, is it suitable for the suppliers of that service, internal suppliers and external suppliers? How do you make all that holistic kind of process work together? So it's looking at that kind of end-to-end adjustments process, but also looking at the workplace environment, the physical environment, the digital environment, what kind of barriers we can remove at a kind of a company-wide level, but also maybe at a team level as well. We also have a great staff network. Employee resource group. We have one for mental health and well-being, and we also have one for disability, and they kind of balance each other out. And it's great to have a resource group that represents the voice of disabled people in the workforce, but also can act as a consulting group when we have change and we say, what do you think of this? And they can give us honest feedback on it. And the last kind of point I would say to kind of wrap up that kind of core role is to think about the inner confidence for disabled staff, to give them the confidence to ask for adjustments, to give them the confidence to challenge, to give them the confidence to tell their story. So that kind of ring of inner confidence for disabled colleagues. How can we put that through? We have an internal program that staff can go on to work with other staff, but it's externally hosted, so it's a safe space to build that inner confidence for staff. So that's the kind of gone.
Sorry, I was going to say, tell me a bit about TAG, because we spoke a lot about TAG, and I love it.
So back to the workplace adjustment service. So imagine you've got maybe a central point for funding. You've got you've got your different departments supplying different services for that, but actually they tend to work quite siloed. For example, you have your facilities team, you have your HR team, you have your health and safety team, and then you have your learning development team, and everyone's kind of in different departments. So tag is something I developed in a previous company, and I've kind of brought it with me every time I've moved company. And tag stands for the adjustments group. And it's just a working group of people who deliver adjustments on behalf of their departments. And it's a really, really simple thing that we meet once a month for an hour, and we go through what's not working, we go through what's working, we go through things that we can improve. And so it's a constant flywheel of small kind of incremental change to improve that process. The other thing that TAG does is it shares knowledge between the different departments. So, for example, if something comes up, for example, on technical training, does that
Mm.
fit in within the technology team? Does that fit in with the training team, or does it fall between the gaps? And does someone else need to pick it up? So sharing that knowledge about where things sit and the processes of when things get distributed or who pays for things, that's what TAG does. And I've run that for best part of 3 years at Channel 4 now. But it's that constant flywheel of change.
The continual improvement, and it's something I know Susan will touch on later, is so important, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
I guarantee there'll be people on this call now who will say, oh, but we've got a workplace adjustments process. But they set it up maybe 4 or 5 years ago, haven't they?
And every barrier, so I always think of TAG as removing barriers to remove barriers. So your workplace adjustment process is removing barriers from staff who have condition impairment. And by removing the barriers from those staff, they can be effective and efficient and happy and progress and be promoted. So TAG is all about identifying those barriers and actively removing them. And the people who come along to TAG are the people who are able to deliver at the operational kind of coal face those changes to make that difference. And it's not about money. It's about those small incremental changes. And actually, 9 times out of 10, they actually don't cost anything. So it's not about big procurement. It's not about big change. It's about a thousand small changes. And some people call it Kaizen, some people call it lean. Susan is a much better expert at it than me, and she'll come and talk about it a little bit later on. But it's having that focused goal about having a clear vision about what you want to achieve and actually making things more effective and efficient to get to the point where you're confident that you're giving a good service to staff and their managers is a great place to be.
But in amongst all that, you are measuring the successfulness, aren't you? You're looking
Yeah,
at, has it removed the barrier? Does it work?
so we keep a list of everything that comes up and we have a log of that. And obviously we don't want those things to come up again. We also have service level agreements with our external assessors, and we can see if that's working. We also measure the engagement and the satisfaction of our staff through our network surveys and our staff surveys. And we managed to get up to 25% of people sharing they have a condition or impairment through our
That's
HR
really
system.
high. That's high. That's a huge level of trust you built.
Yeah.
Is it because it's Channel 4 and you're out there? I mean, Channel 4 has always been a little bit cutting edge when it comes to.
I think you need to have the confidence in the business to support, but I think also you need to use terminology which people self-identify with rather than, for example, maybe a legal model which they may not identify with. So it's understanding how people self-identify and then getting the trust. If they feedback that the survey is not working for them, make that change, make that small improvement. Tell them that you made their change, and then they'll trust you a little bit more the next time round. So surveys is all again about building that trust, building that momentum. And so it's honing things over time to make it better. And even making it a better experience to update your data. If you can do it in 2 clicks rather than 7, you're going to get more people to share their data than not.
For sure. Can you give me an idea of what your costs are that are involved in making adjustments? Do you have an average person cost or?
We set an average person cost, but that's just to help set our budget. So, for
Yeah,
example, to say we say £50 per person per year, we set that as a budget, as
that's
a
across the
forecast
business.
across the. It's like an on cost.
Okay, so it's a bit like an insurance cost thing.
Yeah, so if you buy a computer, if you buy a table, if you buy insurance for a member of staff, every member of staff needs that. So we see that as an on cost. And then we can draw down from that budget. And completely depending on where we are in the maturity of of adjustments, that will depend on how much we draw down. But that's the kind of budget we would set, and we could adjust that year on year depending on how well it's working.
Do you ever go over the budget?
We haven't so far.
I love that. So it's not as expensive lots of people think it's going to be. You just have to
No.
manage the process, measure it, and make it visible.
Yeah, but I mean, we have a duty to provide adjustments. There's plenty of support out there, also from places like Access to Work, and also places like RNIB and RNID to provide assessments as well. So absolutely, seek the funding, seek the support where you need to. But yeah, centrally funded is very, very important to get that streamline of efficiency and cost.
I love that. If I can, Giles, thank you for that. We're going to come back to you and get you to answer some of the questions I wanted to run through.
Tracy, sorry to interrupt you.
Please.
Question from Michael Vermish in Q&A. If you can have a look and answer.
I can't. I've just realised, talking about making adjustments, my
Okay.
adjustment is I need a bigger screen. I've been trying to read it with a magnifying glass. Mariam, are you able to read it?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you mind? And hello, Michael.
Do you measure the number of requests and turn around and set a SLA against these? Do you publish anywhere the numbers? How will you feel on these should be published externally via example, disability confidence? Do you use disability passport system? Where do you feel are your biggest blockers? Would it help if people, managers would get more trainings? Just a couple of questions.
That's a very Michael question there. Thank you, Mariam. So just to recap a bit, do you do the whole process, Giles? Do you actually measure, how many people have got seen to internally, have been helped internally, and how quickly? Do you work with the line manager to make sure that they're put in place, that it's working, that barriers are removed?
So we do measure the SLA, for example, from referral to report return, depending on that's an SLA because we can guarantee that. How quickly then things get implemented, it's depending on the case. So we don't tend to measure that so kind of diligently in terms of, because it's such a variable. Should it be published externally, for example? I think SLAs, for example, with external suppliers, we're happy to publish that because that's not that sensitive and it's kind of an industry standard. But I think kind of how can you guarantee the end-to-end process for everybody? You'd have to look at the average over maybe a couple of years to see what that would be like. Do you have a disability passport system? We have an inclusive passport, so that covers all protected characteristics, as there's an element of intersectionality that we need to consider. Where do you feel are the biggest blockers? I suppose for me, the biggest blockers is thinking around the inclusive design piece, so we're not introducing barriers through change. Because you can retrofit accessibility and inclusion as much as you like, but actually for me the biggest blockers are either legacy systems or introducing change which doesn't have inclusive design. And would it help if people managers get more training? Absolutely. I was on a people manager training session this morning with Simon Minty, and it's very, very important we train our managers.
We love Minty as well. He's great. Susan, did you have a comment?
Oh, I've got lots. But
cool.
I was actually just thinking there in terms of introducing barriers. A classic story, of course, is that they've got the premises brilliantly painted in different colors, so visually impaired can figure out where the doors are and so on. And then they do a refurbishment 5 years later and they put it all back to cool gray.
Yeah.
You have to refurb the refurb, right? Because it wasn't built into the refurbishment cycle plans that can be 5 or 7 years long, right? So yeah, I'm just agreeing with Giles.
Wonderful. One of the things I was going to say in terms of the length of time, the Business Disability Forum did a survey on Lloyds Banking Group over a period of 3 years and actually found that the average from assessment from the initial contact through to actually getting the adjustments and the training was 14.25 days. And I think that's quite a considerably short amount of time compared to if you were to use Access to Work, for example, which at the moment we know is under considerable stress and the length can take quite some time. So Giles, thank you for that. And Michael, thank you for a great many questions. That's good. Susan, I wanted to really sort of set the scene for people to say, I mean, Susan, I worked for Susan for some years ago, and you really have spent decades, I think it's fair to say, from about the age of 11, challenging the status quo on disability and adjustment management. So why now have you written this playbook, and what made this the moment to release Everyone Wins a Balloon, and how did it come about?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. Frustration at how many people at every level of an organization go through the yes, but thing. Yes, adjustments really matter, but it's going to cost too much, or but we don't have any people with disabilities, really not enough of them to warrant doing this. What I really like is when they both come together. So the same person will say, well, actually, we don't have enough disabled people to warrant, going to all of that trouble. And if we did, well, it would open the floodgates.
Yeah.
That one was really always stuck with me. But also I realized that I started to write some guidance because someone had asked me to do a basic sort of piece of work on it, and realized that I was writing for people who didn't want to read it. Because by definition, the people I wanted to read this were the ones who were saying yes, but. And so I worked away on it for quite a while. And then through Purple Space, I was part of their the very first global summit for Disability Employee Network leaders last October, and realized that it was the second, they were asked around the world, people in work with disabilities, what are the 3 things you want your employees to do better? One was tell stories that normalize all this stuff. 2, make adjustments, right? Do it properly. And 3, learning directly from your own people. Well, actually, all those things come together. If you listen to your people, you discover they're waiting 6 months for an adjustment that they asked for that would have made it easier for them to do their job. And then you start telling stories about what goes on in the business, when the impact on the business when it works right, and it reinforces the cycle and so on. So I thought what I could do is craft something that was written for Purple Space, in purple, that would be of use to Disability Employee Network leaders when they're talking to their senior executives. And that if a senior executive sponsor with a disability ERG in, I don't know, Lilly, sits down and they start to go through this, particularly the gap analysis at the end,
Yeah.
maybe I would reach the people who maybe didn't want to read it, except that Giles said, let's sit down and talk about this together. And so, as I was thinking about this conversation today, I was reminded ages ago of a very cynical guy who had said, oh, this business case stuff, he didn't really buy into this. And finally he said, I get it. Impairment is what happens to you, your condition, the stutter, you stutter, that happens to you. Disability is what we do to you. We won't let you take an extra 15 seconds in the video interview. So you don't even get a chance to get at the job. So the condition happens to you, but then it's actually management's failure to make the adjustment which causes the extended sickness absence that undermines your productivity, undermines your sense of engagement with the business. The management failure to make the disability-related adjustments for people who often think, I don't really have a disability, I have a health condition. And so when I'm hearing Giles talk about the 25%, what we are learning now is that at least 20 to 25% of any workforce will have a disability and or a long-term health condition. That's really important, because for many people who need adjustments, it would never occur to them that their condition put them in the same boat as a guy who's deaf or blind or in a wheelchair. So I started looking at where the obstacles were, why we're still talking about this after so many years in a way at it. And there's some gaps in understanding. People just don't understand the impact on the business of management failure to make adjustments. And so they've got no idea in many companies how many people are on extended sickness absence because that adjustment wasn't made. They don't understand the impact of management failure to actually make adjustments on employee wellness, on engagement, the hidden costs that are also running alongside sickness or absenteeism. I was really taken by some work that Deloitte did, where they discovered that they were looking at wellness, the investment in wellness programs, and realized that Deloitte hadn't seen the connection between failure to change the light bulb that's giving me migraines as migraines being unwellness, right?
Yeah.
Somehow migraines are disability because it was caused by a light bulb. It just didn't make any sense to me. We're also looking at how Microlink is documenting the cost savings triggered by making adjustments in terms of saving millions on sickness absence, and realized that there were senior leaders in the business who had no idea what the sickness absence was costing, but neither did they have any idea what it cost to manage a complaint, a formal grievance internally, the hours of management time. Then it goes up to HR time. Then it goes up to maybe employee relations and legal, never mind bringing in external advisors. And so it's part of not understanding that disability, that making adjustments is not special treatment for people who can prove they're technically qualified in law to trigger that obligation, that it's actually about productivity. I think when this really hit me years ago, I had the chairman of one of Europe's huge car manufacturers say that he'd gone on a tour of his factory. So it's like the king of the factory being led around. And a group of women who were working on the line. So the cars are going past and they're there doing what they do. And they said, excuse me, sir, but the tools are so big. They're designed for men. Our hands are smaller. At the end of each shift, my hands are just really crippled, really going up. And so he went back to base and he said, give those women tools that enable them to do their job. Now, was that a disability intervention or was that a productivity intervention? And for me, that's the bit that we've just really failed to communicate. And certainly, there's this misunderstanding that somehow disabled people are all disabled right now.
Yeah.
And it's like, we've got them. It's 1.3 million and they're over there. But actually, of course, most people acquire their disabilities in adulthood. 1 in 3 people, 50 to 64, have a disability. And that nearly 50% of people coming forward for the Microlink managed processes have acquired their disability in the last 3 years. And so I was really taken by what you were saying, Giles, that this is an insurance-based approach, proactively anticipating that people who were not disabled when you re-engineered this process are going to benefit next year and the year after, and that you're building in a process that enhances everyone's productivity eventually. I think it really is like a kind of insurance policy that ensures that you're not losing good people, that you don't generate ill will, and that if there's anything we've learned, is actually these two things go together. Treating people properly is good for business. It just so happens in this instance that you deliver, that disability equality is made possible when you're barrier-free for groups, the ramps and the websites, and when you make adjustments for individuals. So you treat people properly by doing both. And that actually, at the same time that you're winning the balloons, hence the title on my little thing about.
Well, that's why I was going to ask you, where did that come from? Why everyone wins a balloon?
It's because when you treat people properly, they're winning balloons and you're enhancing productivity. And so the guys at the top have just won 2 or 3 big balloons. Everybody wins because this is where treating people properly actually is good for business. And so what I've tried to do in the guide is to make it clear that we need to communicate differently. And I'm hoping that everyone in this call today is an internal advocate. So you're going back to base, saying, actually, we've kind of got this wrong. We've been thinking about it as special treatment for people who somehow magically qualify as disabled if they can prove it. And we don't realize that actually treating people differently is how we treat them fairly, and it's how we enhance productivity. And so it's not special treatment, it's efficient and fair. And it's the word efficiency that is so often missed. But what I'm still hearing, and I can't believe this, is that we've still got HR sending out little instructions saying we have to treat every applicant exactly the same.
Yeah.
So picture this one. So you've got the next Stephen Hawking's is sitting in his chair at the bottom of the stairs, and you've got your interview up 2 flights of stairs, and you think it's perfectly fine to lose him because you're treating everybody the same in order to deliver equal opportunities. Nobody thinks that anymore. But we need to make it really explicit that actually requiring someone who has limited dexterity, maybe arthritis, to hold the game controls at that interview, we're losing a really good person. It's just the same as forcing the next Stephen Hawking to climb the stairs. Or
What was that story you used to tell about it? I can't remember which organisation it was in Canary Wharf when they refitted, set up the new desks and put the mice on the desk. And they were all right-handed mice, weren't they,
darling,
for thousands of colleagues? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll tell that story. So this is a classic, though I'll come back to the left-handed theme towards the end of my presentation. 9,000 new workstations and 9,000 right-handed mice. And when the guy who was responsible for that particular project said to me, I said, so 10% of your workforce is now going to be using the wrong mouse. And he said, and he was chairman, what do you mean? And I said, well, you need a left-handed mouse if you're left-handed, or you're at risk of damaging your hand, carpal tunnel, whatever is going to happen here on the right hand. And he said, but I'm left-handed. You're telling me there are left-handed mice? Now, there are more than 200 different kinds of mices out there, right? All kinds of mice. And that gives me a chance to say, and doctors don't know that. But anyway, I was going to come back. And so the point here I was going to make was that when I'm asked why I wrote this, I was talking about stuckness, the things that we're really stuck on. One is the assumption that this is all best left to doctors and that somehow diagnosis is the answer, when we all know a diagnosis doesn't tell a manager what to do. It takes me back to that impairment or your condition happens to you, your arthritis, disability, what we do to you, force you to use gaming controls, right? Doctors are not the answer. We need job-relevant solutions and expertise, not medical labels. And productivity is a management, not a medical responsibility. And so actually that takes you into risk mitigation territory as well.
Yeah.
We're stuck in the assumption that somehow this is an HR and diversity thing. But very few companies actually give a diversity manager the power to get the CTO to change the way they manage technology.
Yeah.
Very few diversity managers can change what procurement does. I don't know, can anybody change what procurement does? But that's another conversation. And certainly, I've never seen a diversity manager who could tell facilities management that they had to move that parking bay for a guy who's newly disabled next week, right? It's as Giles was alluding to, you have to get everybody in this whole end-to-end process lined up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that actually, the other part of the yes obstacle, it comes up when people say, well, but we don't have any data which proves we have a problem. I'm sure it's okay out there because we don't have any data which tells us it isn't. And of course, the reason you don't have meaningful data is because you don't have a managed process. By definition, ad hoc, with the Government of Canada, there were 7 different entry points. They were going sometimes to OC Health, sometimes Health and Safety, sometimes they'd start with Employee Relations, sometimes they'd start over here with HR. And so it meant that nobody had any idea what was really going on in the business at all. Mind you, the good part of that is also there's no data which proves I'm wrong.
But can I just ask, I'm going to interrupt to ask, what's behind, I mean, you talk about the sticking with what is currently. What's behind that and how do we change it? Because I hear so many people saying, oh, but we've got a process, but they haven't.
Well, you see, one of the things that I really liked about what Giles was saying was he's got a continuous monitoring and improvement monthly basis. Very few organizations ever do a what happens when survey. They waste time trying to persuade people to confess that they have a disability and count the numbers that have actually self-ID'd in some way. But that number doesn't tell you what to do. There's no right number. It doesn't tell you if anything's working or not working. Very few on an annual basis would go out and ask managers and the team, How's it going when you ask for an adjustment, right? What happens when? And so where we see companies really start to make progress is a what happens when survey. That's why I was so pleased to see the Canadian government, I helped them on that particular survey, actually publish what they found out, because very few organizations would ever publish this insider glimpse into what happens when people ask. And so they discovered, for example, that 77% of people with visible disabilities were required to prove they had a disability
No.
before they could just, get their adjustment. That's
Wow.
quite typical. That's quite typical all over the world, because they're still thinking this is special treatment for people who are legally entitled, to force us to consider, is it too expensive to make that adjustment? And that trail of distrust, of course, then triggers what I call that compliance paradox, where the more you try to just comply, the more people become, you generate ill will, you generate complaints, you generate sickness absence, you lose people. It's just obvious. Of course you would. And so when you say, what do we do about it? We start by, one, leveraging the insights that you get when you learn directly from your own people, is to start to gather insights into what happens when people ask, and that you use your employee resource groups to help you get those insights, but that actually you have to go out there and consciously look for a better understanding of what it's like to work here. Not forgetting, of course, that if you can't make adjustments efficiently, quickly, and in such a way that people actually use whatever they're provided, you certainly are going to lose out on disabled talent. They might not even come in the first place, but then they'll be with you for 3 months and they'll walk or roll out the door. What we're seeing actually is that the benefits of the trust-based system. And so we've got a range of companies, from GSK, Bank of England, EY, KPMG, BAE Systems, and so on, that are consciously going out to create a trust-based managed adjustment system. And I call it adjustment management because the word management gets lost when you just call it workplace, right? It has to
Yeah.
be managed. And so what I've done is picked up 12 critical success factors on this inside front cover, saying, we know that when you look at what happens when people ask for adjustments, if these 12 things aren't happening, it's going to take too long, needlessly long. You're going to have a needlessly shambolic, difficult to navigate process. So for example, if it's managed, there has to be a manager. Wow,
Yeah.
how hard is that? But whose job is it? Full-time.
But that's unusual. I mean, Giles is in an unusual position, isn't he, to do that?
And Andy Garrett managing that process.
Yes.
GSK. And that manager needs to be talking to someone senior who has taken responsibility to make sure that you're getting consistent treatment, so that people with disabilities know they will be treated fairly and efficiently around the piece. Remembering, of course, that productivity is a management, not a medical issue. And so that means that you would see the referrals to occupational health go down considerably. But you can tell quite quickly when you look at a company, if the first thing they do is send you, when you ask for a Braille keyboard, to occupational health, you know you have a problem. What will they do? They will say, yes, she is blind. True story from Barclays a long time ago. We also know that it has to be easy to find. How hard is that? So many organizations don't know where to go, and the managers don't know where to go. And remember that for many managers, they're only going to see 1 or 2 people they think have a disability in any given year, right? You don't have managers that have got years and years of, yes, I've managed 6 blind guys and 5 deaf ones, and I've got people with speech, and they've got all this experience. No, and they certainly have very little experience of what happens when someone is diagnosed with MS or Parkinson's, or how do they adapt the work environment in that situation? And the individuals don't know either. We also are echoing everything that Giles has said about there has to be some way to make sure that managers don't pay. Now, I don't care how you make that happen. At GSK, they've positioned this whole service in their facilities and property division. I think they're arguing that property makes sure the doors are wide enough for people to come in to climb through the windows. So why not write enough for everybody to come in? Adjustments. And that you trust people to self-refer. Hugely important. I can guarantee you, just like apples fall down, that if you force people to prove they're disabled enough, you're going to undermine all your efforts to enhance productivity, engagement, wellness, all the positive business benefits. And that you have a pre-approved catalog. This is where Microlink has, spent years doing the research. And what it means, of course, if you've got a pre-approved catalog of kit and softwares and bits and pieces, then you've already made sure that IT have a given approval to, yeah, we can plug it in. And procurement have already said, yep, we're not going to go out and insist on 3 bids for something where we know there's only one that we really want here anyway. And so there's some basics there. And I would just close, I guess, by saying we stress that this is about reasonable adjustments, not just adjustments, it's reasonableness. So if you're hiring a waitress and she wants to work from home, you don't have to. We just got to get this back to grown-ups talking to kids. It's reasonable. Can the team tolerate this? I really like Giles has got a passport that presumably says if you need to come in late for childcare responsibilities, you come in late for that. You need to come in because, I don't know, Canada's under threat by America to come over our borders. Well, maybe you want to come in on a Friday a little later. The point is that this is a good manager is balancing the skills and needs of his group. Yeah. And though I would remind us that people with disabilities in your companies have a legal right to adjustments. Kate Nash was making a very interesting point the other day that a pregnant woman feels entitled to maternity leave, which costs thousands in places. But that same woman, if she had arthritis, would hesitate to ask for a 200-pound piece of kit because she's having trouble using the keyboard. Because we never say they're entitled, because we've tried so hard to make it clear that because the business is so much, you shouldn't have to go down the entitlement road. And because nobody wants this whole thing to be grounded in compliance.
Yeah.
Let's remember that. And that for me, my final observation was going to be with access to work. What we know from looking at thousands of cases is that the average cost is between 1,900 and 1,200 pounds. You average it out across the bids. And that I think what access to work is, if it's under 1,000 pounds, you're supposed to pay for it as an employer anyway. Well, by the time you've navigated all that bureaucratic government delays and paperwork and everything else, just get it, just buy it. So for me, the one that really caught my eye the other day was if you had a chief finance officer who was left-handed, as we were talking about earlier, you would just give her a left-handed mouse. But if she was in a car accident and she lost the hand, I betcha a lot of companies would send her to occupational health. They would say, give her a left-handed mouse. Why don't we just give her a left-handed mouse? We have to focus on the impact of the condition, the impact of that individual's reality, and say, can we adapt so that this person, that we make it easier for them to do their job? That's the key question. How can we make it easier for you to do your job? And that means in the biz, we need some expertise grounded in the reality of what it means to be a human being. And that's what we're talking about here.
I saw you do a talk. Well, I've seen you do many talks, but one at EY sticks in my mind at One More London, where you're standing in front of 400 or 500 individuals and running through a list of very common disabilities and long-term health conditions. And Susan, as you said to the group, where you can stand, please stand. And everybody stood up thinking, what's going on? And as you go through the list, you invite people to sit down if it affects them or a loved one. Now, this list, we're going back maybe 10, 12 years now, but it didn't include neurodivergence in any form at that time. So take that outside of the equation. But it took maybe 2 or 3 minutes and everybody of that 500 audience was sat down.
Except for one guy. And we decided he was deaf. afterwards. I don't know if that gets me into trouble for saying it. However, that's really important because what I learned from that exercise is never say diabetes at the beginning because half the audience sits down.
Yeah.
So I started to switch the list with cystic fibrosis and autism, and mention a few others, da 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 da. And so autism was on the list, yeah, even then.
I'd forgotten that.
But now with the numbers, some people would have to sit down twice or three times. And so,
Yeah.
you get them up and down and up and down. But you catch my drift. The point of that whole exercise was to show that actually we have such narrow stereotypes of who has a disability, and that we includes the C-suite and line managers and their families and friends, right? This isn't just about people in business. This is people in London and Birmingham. It's quite societal wide. But in the context of business, I think the essence of the game for me now is this gap analysis. So what I've done here at the end is I've said, some of you may have come across proof points, might be another way of looking at it. What do people see, hear, and feel when it's going well? And what do they see, hear, feel if it's not really? So I'm not looking for data because in an unmanaged process, you don't have data. I'm looking for, well, people say it's really easy to figure out where to go and you get help. And on this side, they say adjustments, we make adjustments. And so you can just start to go through this with your senior colleagues and say, well, actually, maybe we need to start moving towards being on that side a bit. And it gives you some indicators, as Giles was saying, about that continuous improvement. Let's just move a couple of these over. It should be easy to find. And then, of course, we get that clear link between making the adjustments and productivity, which means we wouldn't see any longer companies who would bring Microlink in, for example, to offer the service and then not tell anybody.
It seems to be a big secret. Lots of people seem to, there's a dirty secret about it. They won't let us talk about us supporting them, which I would have thought it would have been a great thing to say, we're inclusive of everybody. Look, we've got Microlink on board and they help us. But no, they're quite shy about it. I think it's the best news story.
Well, I think in some organizations, there's just a fear that they would then have to spend some money because they don't see that they're investing in productivity. What we really need is a chief productivity officer sitting on every C-suite.
Yeah.
Because I say HR doesn't have the brief, the mandate to tell procurement what to do, right? And when one of the ways GSK saved a lot of money was they bought expensive, more expensive quality chairs at the beginning when they moved into the building.
Yeah.
So they didn't have to endlessly buy new chairs for people who were in agony because of the stupidly designed cheap chairs, right? So there's so many ways of doing this. If you're focused on productivity, when you're focused on legal compliance, it goes down real fast.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, Susan, though, with this guide, because I mean, I do love the guide. That goes without saying. And for everyone on the call and for everyone who's registered, we're going to send a copy out to you. And I'd encourage you to really read it and share it with as many people as you can. But who exactly was this guide designed for? I mean, and if you could put Everyone Wins a Balloon into a specific person's hands within an organization, who would it be?
Well, it is a disability employee network briefing. It's meant to be by anyone who's trying to persuade up, helping them to develop the ethical and commercial rationale for doing this. This isn't just a business case that somehow I'm only going to do this if you can prove I'm going to immediately sell more bananas or whatever my retailer outfit is selling. It's the ethical and business rationale for enhancing improvement to business, delivering the business improvements that also benefit disabled people. But it's meant to be for people who are then trying to persuade and to give them practical tools. So there's tips for what to say when you're starting to open that conversation. Focus on, but the values of the business. Say this is aligned with the values of the business. Let's help you demonstrate you're walking the talk. I just coined that little phrase, walking the talk. But some people do seem to be walking the talk. And in a very real way, being able to demonstrate that you do this properly is where you build the trust across the workforce that you can be actually proud of that employer brand. Yeah.
And I mean, that goes back again to you, Giles, doesn't it, with what you've been doing at Channel 4 in saying, trust us, tell us. We're not measuring it in terms of commercial viability, but we know it's the right thing to do. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, do you ever have arguments or pushback on costs or changes or anything?
I think there's always constraints of time, resource, knowledge. I think there's always business operational constraints, and you always have to work within them. So sometimes there's pushback in terms of that. But if you can get that inclusive design mindset, thinking about things from day one, then the resistance to change is less. But it's getting that maturity of thinking that takes time.
And maturity of process, which you're so familiar with, Giles, because the classic story for me when I really started to get into this space a time ago, a huge global company, a woman came up to me and said she'd been waiting 18 months for the light bulb to be changed that was giving her migraines. And it still hadn't been changed, and she was still taking time off every month with these dreadful migraines. Now, when I looked into it, it turned out that it was a huge process issue. There might have been some nasty people in the middle of it, but I don't think so. It turned into, well, there was nothing in the contract with facilities management that said that they could buy one light bulb. They buy 10,000 bulbs at a time. There was nothing that said who was going to pay for that light bulb, who was going to pay for installation. Somebody in health and safety sort of went, well, if it gives her migraines, what about everybody else? Oh my God. And they pulled back like that. And then, of course, you got the special treatment arguments. She's exaggerating. There's no, yeah, it's not real. It's not a disability. And in fact, if she'd been in Brazil, that's true. It's not a disability technically in Brazilian law. But you have to really go looking for where it's not a disability technically. But the main thing was procurement. And I can tell you that was probably 9 years ago, I heard that story. And we still haven't got key performance indicators for facilities management in terms of how quickly they're supposed to respond. I'm looking at Giles nodding at me, and time again, the are in FM.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to draft one now. Actually, GSK is partnering with Sodexo to put a framework together
Nice.
to help us to share it through the members of the Global Business and Disability Network and others, of course, on what you require from FM, because it's not recognized that they have a direct impact on how you make adjustment management happen or not.
Yeah, I love that.
Tracy,
So,
sorry,
yes.
interrupt. One of the questions was, what's the biggest barrier? I think Michael asked it right at the beginning. And having that legacy infrastructure. So if you've got a lighting system that's a single lighting system in your whole building, it's very difficult to change. If you've got an existing legacy HR system, it's very difficult to change. So it's those legacy things that when you do make those change, you've got the opportunity to design out those barriers that you've come across, but capture where those barriers have happened, because that list grows and grows and grows. And then when you come to that procurement, when you come to that change, look back at those lessons learned, because that's gold dust.
I think it's really important. I mean, I've gone around and done physical audits for some clients, and you look at the things where they're moving out of London, perhaps into their own premises, the cost of London offices being so high, and they're moving into new premises, and you're saying this is your opportunity to actually start it clean. Because refitting websites, I mean, I'm still horrified at the number of top 500 FTSE 500 companies that don't have accessible websites. I know they use overlays, they use things like Recite Me, but actually built in WCAG 2.2 or soon to be 3 point something, it just doesn't exist. But refitting a website, like refitting a building, is hugely expensive. So the more that you can think about it and plan it up front, as with any kind of adjustment, is really important. Getting your catalogue together, Giles, how difficult was that?
That's not too bad. I think if you do have a group like TAG, it's much easier, because you can go around to each of the departments and ask them, what do you regularly supply, and then you just capture that in terms of how do you supply it, who's the supplier, what's the cost, what's the make, what's the website you get it from. So any questions around that particular product, you have a kind of an asset list, and you can keep building upon that, and obviously refresh it as things kind of move on. So I mean, sitting down, it would probably take you a good couple of months to do it, but once you've got it, it's so useful because if people are making assessments and they're recommending things, internal assessors, external assessors, whether that be a private or through Access to Work, always try and get them to recommend from that approved list, because the cost of trying to implement something that's not on that list in terms of time and effort is significantly higher.
Am I right in suggesting I've heard somewhere it's like 100 grand to get things through info security? Or did I dream that?
I don't. It depends. I mean, there's
For
processes
big
for getting.
enterprise licenses and things like that in companies.
I think, Susan, you're probably more au fait
Doug?
with the cost of
Um,
change
I
from
think,
that point of view.
well, I think, Giles, the catalog that you're describing, part of that pre-approved little message, pre-approved catalog, is that IT have approved plugging it in, right? As well as procurement approved that they won't go out to market every time, And so I think what we've seen is the contracts with IT suppliers, you know, the Fujitsus of this world and the Atoses and so on, those sorts of things, though I'm not naming them in this story. I have a senior executive say that while the piece of kit, I don't know, say JAWS or something, is only going to cost us 1,000 quid, Fujitsu, for example, is saying in the contract it's going to cost 100 to go through and make sure that it doesn't display every bit
knock out anything else
that they get out of business.
Yeah.
Now, I only had that quoted to me once, but nonetheless, if the need for this kind of flexibility isn't built in to the contracts with IT suppliers, facility suppliers, and so on, it means that, as Giles is saying, the legacy contracts and stuff will come up, and these sorts of things are possible. So you have to.
I mean, we've seen a huge move, obviously, to non-cloud based, although the government's now talking about the NHS being all cloud, which is a very big shift for them. But certainly for large professional services, law firms, people like BAE, Bank of England, etc., they're all very much, you can't even have wireless headsets because of the security implications. But if you're outsourcing your IT, that's another big area that you can fall down on, because they're not necessarily specialists in assistive technology either. So they won't have come across non-cloud based solutions, which is often a lot cheaper, that you can plug and play quite quickly.
But I can still see this guy. He was a DG at HMRC, our tax people. He was saying that actually, if you think that security is your excuse for not making adjustments to the technology for disabled people, what you'll find is that if a disabled employee needs to do something, they'll find a way around it, right? And so all your security stuff goes down the board because people around it. So he says, so you have to bring the two together and there is no conflict. Now, if the tax guys could say that, then it's true and it can be done. And that's where getting your CTOs to really up their skills in this domain is so important.
Susan, if there was one thing that you wanted every leader listening, if you wanted every person here that's going to go and talk to their leaders about this, what would you want them to understand is maybe the first step, or how are they going to act now? What are they going to do?
One thing.
Well, I mean, we'd like they did the whole thing, but one thing.
All right.
One thing.
Well, one thing. One thing is that they're investing in productivity and they need to make it somebody's job to enhance productivity. Right? It's somebody's job. It has to be managed. But I suppose the other thing is to listen to your own people. You know, accept what I'm saying. You do not know what goes on. You don't know how many people are waiting 6 months, 8 months of stuff. You don't know how much sickness absence you've got that could have been prevented. Accept the fact that you're out of touch with your workforce in this domain. I would challenge them, tell me what percentage of your large workforce has a disability? And they'll say 2, 3, 4, oh, I don't know. When you say it's 25% that have a disability and or health condition, you know, if you were managing 25% of your people power in any other domain, graduates, anything, you'd be going, pay attention. You need to understand it. And the way you understand it is you learn directly from your own people, and you go out there and you spend 3 months getting some insight into what happens when you ask for that kind of adjustment, you ask for that kind of adjustment. And I would be saying, have a little rule that says, we really like it when managers say yes, line managers, yep, you can come in at 10 because of your mental health condition, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you want to say no, a written request for denial has to go way up the line. Because
Yeah.
when somebody up there sees that they have denied people anything over and over again across the whole business, because if you don't have a central point of denial, you've no idea how line managers are interpreting what is allowed in this business. You just no idea how many are saying no, or in effect delaying it for 12 months, which is the same thing. And so in the early days, monitoring denials can be really helpful because they have to justify it so that you can then see how they're justifying it. And often it's not really financial cost, it's kind of aggro. It's kind of,
Yeah.
well, put pressure on me, my team, it doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem reasonable, whatever it is. Much of it isn't logical.
It is that fear, and I do see that a lot when I'm talking to companies. And certainly, I think we discussed. I went to a conference last week, and how we're still doing the same messaging over and over again, which is why I absolutely encourage people to read this booklet, to pass it on to everybody that can make decisions within your organization, to pass it to your partner, to pass it to their companies, because this is a game-changing document. You can see from what Giles has done at Channel 4 that it's so important to do this, to get it right, to embed it as business as usual, to take the fear away, but have much, much more productive staff. I mean, I can't promise, none of us can promise that the person who's not doing a job in the corner because of their disability will suddenly be able to do it if you remove all the barriers. But guess what? If they can't, at least you will identify a training need, a mentoring need, a one-to-one need where you can improve and elevate that person's skills. But we've had lots and lots of conversations with insurers, companies like WTW, looking at, they're not hidden costs. A company must be aware of them, but they never come to the fore. The utter expense involved in insuring your EAPs, insuring against employment tribunals. By the way, they run at about £100,000 for each tribunal at the moment, although we have had one, 23, I think it was, and it was for £4.6 million for not making adjustments, for not measuring, for not taking the temperature of your workforce. And that's okay, it's going through insurance, so it's probably only cost you £5,000. But we're now getting to the point where companies and organizations are uninsurable because they're not taking the steps to look after their staff. And it absolutely stuns me why you wouldn't do that. I would never get a racehorse, stuff it in my garage, and then take it out for the Grand National and expect it to win. Why are employers doing the equivalent? Please, please, please read the playbook. Giles is brilliant at sharing his knowledge very kindly on around surveys and the like. And I really love the way that you pivot and change them ever so slightly. And again, it's that continuous improvement. But finally, what I'd like to do is to ask Giles for some last thoughts in the last 3 minutes, and then Susan, please, to close us off. So Giles.
I think that completely independent where you're starting from is just to capture those lessons and to keep capturing those lessons, because if you can learn from all those lessons, then you're going to improve. So it doesn't matter where you're starting from. If something is not working, capture the lesson, improve it, capture the next lesson, improve it, make those small changes. Because when you look back over time, over 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, you'll look back and think, wow, this is where we've come from. And we haven't made a seismic shift. We've just made lots of small changes in the right direction.
I love that. What do they say about a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step? Yeah. Susan.
Well, I just glanced at the chats, and of course the question is £50 per person exorbitant? First, you don't have to pay it all out, right? It's an internal insurance policy. If you've got millions left over, well, I don't, sounds like a good party fund or something. Secondly, is if you've got 10,000 employees, then the negative impact of getting this wrong is amplified a hell of a lot more than if you've only got 500 employees. And so, for example, there was a company that we were looking at where just back pain related absenteeism was costing almost £4 million a year.
Wow.
965 people. And we cut that, or Microlink cut that by 70%. That sort of immediately generates the kind of savings that make the investment in an insurance in case people need stuff in the future way of looking at the world more than reasonable. So a first step there would be, of course, to monitor your absenteeism very carefully and look at how management could have reduced that absenteeism if it was clever. But I suppose my final comment comes back to learn directly from your own people.
Yeah. Get in touch with the guys at Purple Space. They are fabulous. Find out about an ERG or 2 or 3. I know companies have got 31. Thank you so much for joining. Susan, really, really appreciate your wealth of knowledge and sharing your playbook for free, which is fabulous with everyone. And Giles, honestly, learning what you've done with the companies that you've done, we really appreciate it. Your time has been invaluable. Thank you. And we'll see you all again in next month. Yes, next month.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
hosting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.